January 1943. The skies over Western Europe were heavy with the weight of war, the air thick with the scent of burning fuel and the constant hum of engines. Beneath the clouded sky, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses, their engines roaring in perfect synchronization, cut through the cold winter air. Their silver fuselages gleamed, as though mocking the very clouds that hung above them. This was no ordinary aircraft. It was a symbol of American resolve, a weapon of destruction encased in armor. But to the German soldiers stationed below, it was little more than a flying target. In the trenches and bunkers of the Third Reich, there was no reverence for this machine of war. It was a joke, a subject of ridicule. Flying fortress? They scoffed. More like a sitting duck. As the planes neared their targets, the Luftwaffe pilots who would face them were confident, almost dismissive. How could such slow-moving giants, clumsy and cumbersome, pose any real threat? They were, in the minds of the Germans, little more than glorified bombers, easy prey for the more agile. Faster fighters that roamed the skies. But as the first bombs fell, shaking the very earth beneath them, the laughter ceased. The mockery gave way to disbelief. The ground trembled with the sheer power unleashed from those bomb bays. The German defenses, once secure in their arrogance, began to crumble, one explosion at a time. It wasn't the sound of engines or the whistle of falling bombs that silenced the mocking voices. It was the deafening roar of destruction. The B-17, once underestimated, had come to prove its worth in the most unmistakable way. The B-17 flying fortress, developed by Boeing in the late 1930s, was one of the most iconic and powerful bombers of World War II. By the time it entered active service, it was far more than just a bombing platform. It was a symbol of American air superiority. Its robust design, featuring 4 powerful engines and the ability to carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, made it one of the most formidable weapons of the war. But its true strength lay in its defensive capabilities. The B-17 was heavily armed, equipped with up to 13 50-caliber machine guns, making it a challenging target for enemy aircraft. Its ability to take significant damage and still return home earned it its name as a flying fortress. However, its design also made the B-17 a target of scorn among some of the German forces. To many Luftwaffe pilots, the flying fortress was a slow-moving, clumsy behemoth. The aircraft's speed, though adequate for its mission, was no match for the high-performance fighters that the Germans had at their disposal, like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the Focke-Wulf 190. In the early years of the war, German pilots would often regard the B-17 with a sense of superiority. It was viewed as a relatively easy target, ripe for the taking in dogfights that required speed and agility. The Germans believed their own fighters would easily outmaneuver the lumbering bomber. This initial perception was not entirely unfounded. The B-17's defensive armament, though formidable, could only cover a limited area around the aircraft. It was highly vulnerable to concentrated attacks by enemy fighters, particularly those that approached from above or below, angles that the bomber's gunners struggled to defend. Early B-17 missions, particularly those over Europe in 1942, highlighted these vulnerabilities. The planes flew in tight formations for mutual defense, but their effectiveness was still untested in large-scale combat. The first significant exposure of the B-17 to German defenses came in the summer of 1942, when the U.S. Army Air Forces, USAAF, launched strategic bombing raids over Nazi-occupied France. These raids, though damaging to German infrastructure, were costly. The B-17s faced a deadly combination of enemy fighters and flak fire, which made their missions perilous. The high casualty rates among bomber crews painted a grim picture of the B-17's future in Europe. German fighters easily picked off individual bombers that strayed from the tight formations or faltered under concentrated fire. As a result, the early perception of the B-17 as a sitting duck for German aircraft remained prevalent. However, the tides of war were shifting. By 1943, the Allies had begun to refine their tactics and improve their aircraft. The B-17s were no longer sent into battle alone. They were accompanied by long-range fighter escorts, most notably the P-51 Mustang, which could protect the bombers during their raids. This shift in strategy would become a game-changer. The B-17s were no longer alone in the skies. Now, they had the protection needed to strike at the heart of Nazi Germany's war machine. This was the backdrop to the German soldiers' mocking of the B-17, a mockery born from their own confidence and the relative success they had experienced in earlier encounters. The German military command had grown used to their ability to neutralize the bombers with concentrated fighter sweeps and flak artillery. But the B-17's resilience and growing escort strength would soon change their perception. What was once seen as a cumbersome target would soon prove to be a devastating weapon, one that could obliterate entire defenses in a single, coordinated strike. The bombing campaign, known as the Combined Bomber Offensive, intensified as Allied forces launched ever larger raids into Germany and occupied Europe. The focus was no longer just on tactical strikes, but on systematically crippling the enemy's industrial and military capacity. These missions were designed not only to disrupt the German war effort, but to break the morale of the Nazi regime, whose civilian infrastructure was now under constant attack. The B-17 flying fortress would soon be at the forefront of this unrelenting aerial bombardment, with devastating consequences for German forces and civilians alike. The human angle, the crew of the B-17. The men who piloted and crewed the B-17 flying fortress were not simply soldiers, they were a tight-knit team bound by the brutal realities of war. Flying a B-17 into enemy territory was a harrowing experience. The missions were long and dangerous, often lasting 8 hours or more, during which the crews faced relentless threats from enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The crew of a B-17 consisted of 10 men, each with a specific role, from the pilot to the bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and gunners. They relied on one another for survival. The close quarters meant that any failure in coordination could lead to death. For the American crew, the B-17 was more than just an aircraft. It was a symbol of their mission, a representation of their resolve and their willingness to face certain death for the sake of their country. Yet it was also a machine that demanded complete dedication. The bombers would often take severe damage and continue flying, their crews fighting to keep them airborne while still completing their objectives. This resilience became emblematic of the American spirit during World War II. For the German soldiers, however, the B-17's resilience was hard to comprehend. Many German soldiers believed that no machine could withstand such punishment and still function, but the B-17 did, time and again. From a psychological standpoint, the B-17 crews faced constant anxiety, knowing that each mission could be their last. They were often targeted by German aircraft, and many bombers were lost before reaching their targets. But despite the peril, the crews returned to their missions day after day. Their courage was forged in the fires of combat, and the unwavering resolve of these young men made the B-17 not just a symbol of military power, but of human endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. The tactical angle, formation bombing. The B-17's strategic role in World War II wasn't simply as a bomber, but as part of a larger, more complex tactical system. The bomber's primary tactic was to fly in tight formations, which allowed the aircraft to protect one another from enemy fighters. This formation bombing technique was essential for the B-17's effectiveness, as the aircraft's defensive firepower was strongest when coordinated with other bombers in the group. A single bomber, vulnerable to attack, could rely on the firepower and protection of others in the formation. The Germans initially underestimated this tactic, believing that the B-17's defensive guns couldn't provide enough protection when confronted by experienced Luftwaffe pilots. However, as the war progressed, they began to realize that the bombers' formations were an insurmountable challenge. The presence of fighter escorts further shifted the tactical balance, as the B-17s were now able to maintain their bombing runs with increasing efficiency, much to the surprise of the German forces. The combination of the B-17's endurance and the effectiveness of the tight formations forced the Germans to adapt. Luftwaffe pilots had to rethink their approach, often abandoning head-on attacks in favor of more calculated strategies that involved attacking from the rear or below. This shift in tactics was a direct result of the B-17's ability to absorb damage and keep fighting. The bombers' formations acted as a wall, a shield that allowed them to carry out devastating strikes on Germany's infrastructure. The technological angle, the B-17's innovation is key. B-17 Flying Fortress represented the cutting edge of aviation technology in the 1940s. Its design was a marvel of engineering, blending firepower, durability, and payload capacity. The B-17 was heavily armed, with up to 13 50-caliber machine guns placed strategically around the aircraft to ward off attacking fighters. The bomber's robust construction allowed it to take significant damage without losing its ability to complete its mission and return home. Its pressurized cabin allowed the crew to endure high-altitude missions where oxygen was scarce, and the cold was deadly. Perhaps the most critical technological feature of the B-17 was its advanced bomb sight, which allowed the aircraft to deliver highly accurate bombing raids even at great distances. The Norden bomb sight, used in many B-17 missions, was considered so precise that it became a closely guarded secret. This technological advantage made the B-17 a lethal weapon, capable of inflicting significant damage on German targets from thousands of feet above the ground. Yet, despite these advancements, the B-17 was not invulnerable. Its slow speed and large size made it an easy target for fast-moving German fighters. Early in the war, the Luftwaffe took advantage of these vulnerabilities, but the Allies quickly adapted. New tactics and improvements in fighter escort technology, particularly the P-51 Mustang, would soon make the B-17 a much more formidable foe. The leadership angle, American command, and the strategic vision, the EC leadership of the U.S. Army Air Forces, played a crucial role in the development and deployment of the B-17 Flying Fortress. General Hap Arnold, the commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, was a visionary who believed in the potential of strategic bombing. He saw the B-17 as a key component in the Allied strategy to cripple Nazi Germany's industrial and military capabilities. Arnold's leadership and faith in the power of air superiority would shape the American approach to the war. The decision to adopt the B-17 as the backbone of American strategic bombing was initially met with skepticism by some military leaders, who questioned the feasibility of using bombers to destroy industrial targets. But as the war progressed, the effectiveness of the B-17 in missions like those against German factories and oil refineries proved the strategic brilliance of Arnold and his team. The U.S. leadership also made the bold decision to push for long-range fighter escorts, which ultimately allowed the B-17s to complete their bombing missions with greater efficiency and less risk. For the German leadership, however, the success of the B-17 came as a wake-up call. Despite their superior early tactics, the Germans were slow to recognize the strategic shift brought about by American bombers. They failed to fully counter the growing threat until it was too late, and by then, the B-17s had already inflicted significant damage on German war production. The German leadership, once confident in their ability to defeat the bomber threat, had underestimated the ingenuity and adaptability of their enemies. The enemy angle, the German response at first, the German response to the B-17 was one of overconfidence. The Luftwaffe, with its fleet of agile fighters and experienced pilots, believed they could easily intercept and destroy the American bombers. German pilots were initially successful in shooting down B-17s, but they soon realized that the bombers' heavy defensive fire and their formations made them much harder to kill than anticipated. As the war wore on, the Germans shifted their focus to the strategic defenses of their airspace. They developed tactics to attack the B-17s in more coordinated ways, focusing on exploiting their vulnerabilities, such as the bombers' blind spots. However, even as the Luftwaffe adapted, they were continually outmatched by the sheer scale and power of the American bombing raids. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang, compounded the Germans' problems, as they now had to face well-coordinated bomber formations with fighter protection. The B-17's ability to continue bombing missions despite significant losses forced the Germans to question their previous assumptions. No longer were the American bombers an easy target. They had become a constant threat to Germany's war effort, and no amount of Luftwaffe bravado could change that fact. The turning point in the B-17's legacy was not a single moment, but a culmination of strategic shifts, technological advancements, and a brutal realization for the Germans. Their mockery had cost them dearly. By 1943, the skies above Europe were filled with the hum of American bombers, their formations tightening like a steel fist, striking at the heart of Nazi Germany's industrial might. The Germans were learning the hard way that the B-17 was no mere target. It was a harbinger of devastation, and the American forces had perfected the art of aerial bombardment. On the morning of July 28, 1943, the Allied forces launched what would become one of the most significant bombing raids of the war, Operation Gomorrah. The target was Hamburg, a major port and industrial hub for Nazi Germany. The B-17 Flying Fortress, alongside other bombers, was tasked with crippling the city's industrial capabilities. What made this raid different was the scale of the attack and the tactical precision with which it was executed. The Germans had expected attacks, but the magnitude and coordination of this mission caught them off guard. The raid began in the early hours of the morning, with hundreds of Allied bombers flying toward Hamburg. As the B-17s neared their targets, German air defenses sprung to life, flak guns booming and fighter planes swarming the skies. Yet this time, the Germans were unprepared for the sheer resilience and power of the flying fortress. Despite heavy fire, the B-17s pushed forward in tight formations, unleashing their payloads on the city below. The bombs fell relentlessly, each one tearing into the heart of German industrial infrastructure. What truly marked the turning point for the Germans, however, was the bombers' ability to absorb incredible amounts of damage and continue their missions. Even as the B-17s took direct hits from enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, they maintained their formations and completed their objectives. The Germans had long ridiculed the B-17 as an easy target. Now they were witnessing its ability to survive even the most brutal assaults and still inflict catastrophic damage. For the German soldiers, the reality was sinking in. The mockery was over. As the B-17s dropped their bombs over Hamburg, the destruction was overwhelming. Fires raged for days, destroying not only industrial targets but also residential areas, leaving thousands dead and wounded. The air was thick with smoke, the city itself a ruin of shattered glass, twisted metal, and scorched earth. The Allies had proven their point. Not only could the B-17 survive the most intense attacks, but it could cripple Germany's war-making capacity from the skies. The raid marked a decisive shift in the air war. No longer could the Germans afford to dismiss the B-17 as a vulnerable target. In the months that followed, the Luftwaffe's strategy would shift to counter the growing effectiveness of the American bombers, but it was already too late. The damage was done, and the B-17, once mocked, had proven itself as an indomitable force in the Allied arsenal. The raid on Hamburg was just one example of the turning tide. Across the European skies, the B-17s continued their assault on Germany's industrial infrastructure, hitting critical targets like factories, oil refineries, and military installations. The destruction was systematic, deliberate, and precise, and the German war effort began to falter. The B-17, once the subject of German mockery, had become a symbol of Allied resolve and technological superiority. For the Luftwaffe, the heavy losses they sustained in attempting to defend against the B-17 raids were significant. Their fighters were increasingly unable to withstand the coordinated defenses of the American bombers, and the long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang made it impossible for the Luftwaffe to mount an effective counteroffensive. The once proud German air superiority was being eroded with each passing day, and the B-17 Flying Fortress played a pivotal role in that transformation. In the minds of the German soldiers who had once mocked the B-17, there was now only fear. The bombers had crossed the line from being an object of ridicule to an instrument of terror. The B-17s, with their heavy armament, resilience, and sheer destructive power, had proven that they were not to be underestimated. The tables had turned, and the Germans were now fighting a war on two fronts, on the ground and in the skies. As the war raged on, the B-17 Flying Fortress became an emblem of American air power, one that struck fear into the hearts of the enemy and changed the course of the conflict. Its legacy was sealed not just by the damage it inflicted on German targets, but by the psychological impact it had on the German soldiers, who had once believed that their superior tactics and technology would make short work of the American bombers. The aftermath of the B-17's raid on Hamburg and the numerous other bombing missions that followed, reverberated far beyond the rubble of destroyed cities. By the summer of 1943, the German war machine was beginning to feel the weight of Allied air superiority. The once proud Luftwaffe, unable to keep up with the overwhelming onslaught of American bombers, was slowly being worn down. The B-17 flying fortress, once mocked for its supposed vulnerabilities, had become the sharp edge of the Allied offensive, a weapon capable of striking at the very heart of Nazi Germany. The raid on Hamburg itself was a devastating success for the Allies, but it came at a high cost. The city's industrial and military infrastructure was crippled, and civilian casualties were significant, though the primary aim of the bombing campaign was to weaken Germany's war effort. Over the following days, the streets of Hamburg were engulfed in flames as the bombs continued to wreak havoc on factories, oil refineries, and supply lines. The attack on Hamburg was a pivotal moment, signaling to both the Germans and the Allies that the balance of power in the skies had shifted irreparably. The psychological toll on the German soldiers and civilians was immense. The Luftwaffe, once the dominant force in the skies, found itself struggling to deal with the relentless waves of B-17s that continued to strike deep into the heart of German territory. The German soldiers, who had previously mocked the American bombers, now saw them as an existential threat, an unstoppable force that could turn the tide of the war. The sight of the B-17s, their engines thundering through the skies and their bombs obliterating entire cities, began to evoke fear, not just in the soldiers, but among the German civilian population as well. In the wake of the B-17's relentless bombing campaign, German military leaders were forced to reassess their strategy. The Luftwaffe began to focus more heavily on defensive measures, attempting to disrupt Allied bombing raids through a combination of fighter intercepts, flak artillery, and other countermeasures. However, these efforts were increasingly ineffective. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang, made it even more difficult for the Luftwaffe to challenge the bombers' dominance in the air. The Allies, for their part, saw the raids as a crucial step toward defeating Nazi Germany. The relentless bombing campaign led by the B-17 and other bombers was slowly suffocating Germany's ability to wage war. Key infrastructure was destroyed, transportation lines were severed, and Germany's industrial output, essential for maintaining its military, was significantly reduced. While the cost in lives, both military and civilian, was staggering, the strategic value of these bombing raids was undeniable. By the end of 1943, the B-17 had proven itself to be one of the most effective tools in the Allied arsenal. The success of the bombing raids was not just measured in the destruction of German cities and factories, but also in the weakening of German morale. The constant threat of Allied bombers became an enduring part of the German wartime experience. German soldiers, who had once viewed the B-17 with disdain, now dreaded its presence in the sky. The B-17's impact on the war did not end with the bombing of Hamburg. Over the next year, the United States and its allies would continue their strategic bombing campaign, targeting key sites across Nazi-occupied Europe and Germany. The B-17, along with other bombers, would contribute to the systematic destruction of Nazi infrastructure, including the destruction of ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs. The bombing campaign was not without its controversies, particularly regarding the high civilian casualties, but it was undeniably effective in crippling Germany's ability to sustain its war effort. By the end of the war, the B-17 flying fortress had become a symbol of American resilience and technological superiority. It had not only proven itself in battle, but had also shifted the course of the war in Europe. The Luftwaffe, which had once mocked the bomber, was decimated, and the Allies were now able to secure the upper hand in the air. The psychological impact of the B-17's bombing raids was felt across Germany, and its contribution to the Allied victory in Europe was immeasurable. The final toll of the B-17's campaigns was staggering. Over 12,700 B-17s were built during the war, and they flew more than 280,000 combat missions. Of those, 4,550 B-17s were lost in action, but the remaining aircraft continued to strike at the heart of Germany's defenses until the war's end. The legacy of the B-17 Flying Fortress is not just in the planes themselves, but in the courage of the men who flew them and the strategic success they achieved. The B-17 had proven that no matter the odds, even the most derided and underestimated weapon could change the course of history. As the smoke cleared over the shattered cities of Nazi Germany, the legacy of the B-17 Flying Fortress became more than just a story of military hardware. It became a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. The B-17, once mocked for its size, its perceived vulnerabilities, and its slow speed, had proven itself as one of the most devastating weapons of World War II. It had embodied the harsh realities of war, where survival often depended on the courage of those inside the machine, and the machine's ability to endure what seemed like an insurmountable barrage of fire. In the broader scope of history, the B-17's role in the war marked a pivotal shift in aerial warfare. The lessons learned from its design, its tactics, and its operations influenced generations of aircraft development. The B-17 taught the world that even in the face of overwhelming odds, innovation and determination could turn the tide. The Americans, faced with a powerful enemy, had not just built a machine of war, they had built a symbol of defiance. But beyond the technology and tactics, the B-17's legacy is ultimately about the people who flew it. The crews who manned these bombers became part of a larger story, one of camaraderie, sacrifice, and the human cost of war. Each mission they flew, each bomb they dropped, carried not only strategic significance but emotional weight. The laughter of German soldiers at the expense of the Flying Fortress was silenced not by a single event, but by the steady, unyielding persistence of those who believed in their cause and their aircraft. For the men of the 8th Air Force, each flight was a chance to prove that their faith in the B-17, against all odds, was justified. For Germany, the B-17's relentless bombardment became a constant reminder that no defense, no matter how well planned, could stop the determined might of the Allied forces. It was a bitter lesson in underestimating one's enemy, a lesson that reverberated long after the war ended. As the war came to a close, the B-17 Flying Fortress had more than earned its place in history. It was not merely a tool of destruction, it had been an instrument of change, shifting the very fabric of modern warfare. And as the men who flew it returned home, the legend of the B-17 continued to grow, a symbol of courage, endurance, and the spirit of those who fought for victory against overwhelming odds. In the end, the B-17 was more than just a plane. It was a testament to the idea that even the most unlikely forces, whether they be a bomber dismissed as a sitting duck or the unshakable will of its crew, can rise to challenge the seemingly invincible, and in doing so change the course of history forever.